we had reached a consensus that Adam Smith's conception of government activity, or the scope of government activity, was far larger than many people supposed. Those people in particular who subscribed to a kind of caricature version of what Smith believed. And I think that was a necessary correction in the interpretation of Smith. And I think that debate, if you like, is pretty much won. And people like Sam were very influential in making sure that discussion took place. But as I said, I've become a little bit troubled by some of that, a little bit wary by some of it. And the reason that I became wary about it is because I began to read, for an entirely different reason, literature about how government in Scotland was actually organised in the 18th century. And what troubled me when I started to read that is that I realised that much of the discussion that we were having about the role of the state in Smith was one which, if you like, was too stark in the distinctions that it drew between activities undertaken by government and activities undertaken by the private sector or business. And so the title of my talk is Adam Smith and the Public Business. And this is something that's arisen, as I said, out of looking at how the public business was actually undertaken in 18th century Scotland. And what we find when we look at the history of the period is actually that things were far more complicated than a bifurcation between state or government and individuals or business. What we find are a whole set of institutions which are sitting in a kind of grey area between the two. Commissions, charitable associations, clubs, societies. Even where there are clear relationships between the formal apparatus of the national government and the activities that were taking place under the form of public business in Scotland at this time, the way in which they were organised was essentially, or in many respects, as a private concern operated by private individuals who exercised patronage through the offices of these organisations. So this started me along the lines of thinking about how we should conceive of Smith's conception of government, given that the government that he would have experienced was very, very different in some respects from the one that we were having a conversation about in relation to his views on the role of the state. And this led me to start thinking about reasons to look at or defend, if you like, a further or broader examination of Smith's conception of the role of the state, taking on board the idea that it does have a wider role than had traditionally been perhaps advanced by some of Smith's interpreters, but at the same time recognizing that that thing that he was discussing, the public business and the provision of it, was itself far more complex in its nature than we had perhaps acknowledged. So I started reading the literature on the organisation of government in 18th century Scotland, as I say, and that led me to these sets of questions. But it also raised another question for me that I wanted to try and answer, and that was, well, is Smith talking about the world as he would have experienced it? And I think I can make a case by referring to the way in which Smith undertakes his arguments, and in particular in The Wealth of Nations, to say that there is reasonable grounds for us to look at the actuality of local government in Scotland, or government in Scotland in the 18th century. And the basis for that is essentially that when Smith talks about examples of the provision of public works and of the regulation of things like banking, the examples that he draws upon are largely Scottish examples. He compares them to English examples, to French examples, and so on, but the examples that he works through in The Wealth of Nations are the Scottish system of free banking, the Scottish borough school system, the Scottish university system, and the Church of Scotland. If this is true, then it suggests to me that perhaps we might consider what Smith says about the provision of public works in the light of the fact that he has before him the example of how those public works were organised in Scotland in the 18th century. And if we look at that, what we find are some, I think, quite helpful pointers to suggest that that's something that we we're justified in doing that, we're on the right track in doing that. And some of these are straightforward enough. They have to do with his discussion of how public works are to be provided, and they're essentially to be organised as close as possible to the people who enjoy the benefits from them. So the public works such as education are to be provided and organised at a local level. The same is true of roads and other public works such as bridges. This then leads to a question of, well, what did 18th century local government in Scotland look like? How was it organised? How was it funded? How were the services or public works that were actually provided through that system funded, and how were they organised? And that's the question that I want to explore a little bit with you today in connection to Smith's thinking about these matters. The first thing I think we should say is that it's a pretty complicated story. Alexander Murdoch wrote a book on Scotland's government, which was called The People Above, and it talked about how patronage systems operated famously in Scotland at the time, and the power that was held centrally by the Treasury in London and then by officers in Edinburgh was then used as a kind of network of control or patronage that operated through the state institutions. In a nice description of it by the historian John Simpson, the question was, who steers the gravy train? So Scotland and Scottish state activities were seen as a gravy train, which to a large extent I think was true. The universities included in that. But what Murdoch pointed out was that the way in which the government operated in Scotland at this time was really quite complicated. And that was because we could understand it in a number of different ways, a number of different, if you like, layers or types of government institution were in operation in Scotland in the 18th century. And in Murdoch's book, he makes quite a nice distinction that gives us a way into that. He talks about the distinction between the national government in a local setting and the truly local government institutions. And the national government in a local setting, Murdoch points out, was largely run under the auspices of the institutions that remained in Edinburgh for the collection of taxes and the administration of law in Scotland. That is to say, the national government in the towns and the parishes and the counties in Scotland was one where it had two essential roles: the raising of revenue to fund the activities of the national government from London, and the administration of the justice system. And the individuals who were perhaps the most powerful directors of that were the sheriff's depute. So if we look at what Smith says about the three functions of government, famously, that is to do with national defence, to do with the provision of the legal system, and only finally to do with public works, we see that those two functions, the national government functions, the provision of justice and the revenue required to fund defence, are represented centrally in Scotland by institutions which are run out of Edinburgh and then report up to the Treasury in London. But what interests me more, for the purposes of this discussion, are the other institutions, the local institutions, because it's the local institutions, as I mentioned before, that handle the provision of public works within the boroughs, the towns, and the counties in Scotland in the 18th century. Now, there are some kind of intermediate institutions which exist in Scotland at this time, which are not strictly speaking state institutions and not strictly speaking local government institutions. These are things like the commissioners of the forfeited and annexed estates, the body that was responsible for managing and attempting economic development in areas in the Highlands in particular. There are also a body called the Commissioner of Police and the Board of Trustees, which incidentally still exists today. Now, these bodies were, I suppose, what we in the UK call quangos, that is, quasi non-governmental organisations. So they're organisations which are kind of at arm's length from the national government, but which nonetheless have some kind of authoritative role in the provision of a good or a service. So we have these institutions that kind of sit between the two. We have the national government in the local setting, providing law and funding for defence. We have kind of economic development organisations which sit between the local level and the national level, but which are arm's length organisations. They're not elected or anything like that. And then finally, we have the truly local government. And it's the truly local government that fascinates me in this case, because what we find at the local government level, when we look at it, is again a more complex case than we might think, because we have a county government system and a borough government system. And within the borough government system, we have two, if you like, parallel systems of authority. There are the burgesses who run the town through the town council, but there is also the guild, and in particular the dean of guild, who are responsible for economic regulations. And what interests me about this is that it's the dean of guild and the discussion of the dean of guild and the extent of powers that these individuals have that I think we can see coming through in parts of what Smith says about corporations and local government organisation and restrictive practices in the Wealth of Nations. So we have a kind of two sides to local government at the borough level. There are those who are the formal officers of the, if you like, political institutions, and there are those who are involved in the economic organisation of the guild. This is made slightly more complicated, in fact, considerably more complicated by the fact that these are often the same people. So the same person will be the burgess speaking from the political point of view, and he'll also be a member of the guild speaking from the guild's point of view. And so you can see how a kind of how quite quickly a set of political incentives can be generated, which ensure that the interests of those who are powerful within a town are served at the expense of those who are perhaps restricted from membership of the guild or influence on the town council. If we dig a bit further down into this, we discover that if we lay aside the discussion of the regulation of membership of particular professions and so forth, which is a famous part of the guild system, if we lay that aside and we focus instead on the provision of public works and the relationship between these different organisations within the locality, within the borough, or within the county, if we speak at that level, what we find is, again, something that's not perhaps as straightforward as we might think. That is to say that the activities of these various groups is not necessarily funded through local taxation. It's funded, indeed, to some extent by local taxation, but it's also funded to some extent by membership fees. It's funded to some extent by rent of publicly owned lands. And it's funded also to a certain degree, particularly where there is a capital expenditure required, by individual subscription. So one of the things that Smith talks about when he talks about government and local government in the Wealth of Nations is he talks about the provision of schools and how that might be provided for. And if we look at the details of how schools in Scotland were actually provided for at this time, we find that in many cases, the establishment of the school differs from place to place. In some places, there is a formal school building that's been put up by public subscription, not by taxation, but by public subscription, the voluntary donation of funds to the provision for the provision of the good. In other places, the church is used as the school building. In some places, it's the schools have a more developed curriculum, they have more than one teacher and so forth. In others, they can barely retain a teacher. So if you look at the details of the records of the various Scottish boroughs, what you find is a set of quite complicated and complex relationships between how different streams of funding are brought together to serve particular goods or to provide for particular public works. And this is, as I say, this is what has started me thinking about whether or not Smith has something like this in mind, something closer to this in mind, when he talks about public works in the end of the Wealth of Nations. So acknowledging that the government should, or the state or the public should be involved in the provision of these activities doesn't necessarily mean that that will fit into a clear-cut pattern of what we today recognise as a formal political institution taxing and then providing that good. there are a range of different options about the nature of the government that's involved in the local provision of public works for Smith. Some are through borough councils, as I mentioned, some are through through the guilds, some are through relationships between the county and the borough, some are by these public-private commissions that are set up. Still others are by charitable organisations as well. So I don't want to suggest that this is, that we should be bound in our consideration of what Smith thought of government by the very complicated mess that was 18th century Scottish local government. But what it does suggest to me is actually, if we think about it, most of us live in a world where the provision of government is also quite messy. We live in places where there's national government and there's county government and there's town or borough government. We live in places where there may be local charities or subscription organisations that manage particular goods or services. We live in a world where things like the National Trust or the National Trust for Scotland or the Wildlife Trust or the Woodland Trust operate public goods through a funding model that draws on both the state and on individual charitable donations. So there is a complexity here to be explored. And I think it would give us a richer conception of what Smith was talking about and thinking about when he considered the public business, if we consider it possible that many of the public works that he considered to be so important for society to engage in the provision of, were being provided by a range of different formal, semi-formal institutions, and were being funded by a range of different funding models, which went from taxation right the way through to charitable donations. So Adam Smith's consideration of the public business, I should suggest, is something that we've been talking about in Smith studies for quite a while now, but it's something I still think that there's more to be said on, and that we might find even more to say about it if we begin to explore how the government actually operated in some detail in Scotland in the 18th century. Thank you.